Hello, back for the rest of chapter 17. You'll see again, starting off with this picture again, although we're on page 167, and it says it takes him all day, but he makes a raft by weaving logs together. So Brian was frustrated because he didn't know how to get the logs to go together because he had no rope or nails to keep them together. So he figures out a way to weave the logs together so he can make his raft. He's going to start off. I'm going to start off 3 lines down on page 167, where he says, at that point, he sat back on the beach. So at the point where he's thinking about how he's going to make this raft. So I'm going to pick up from there. At that point, he sat back on the beach and studied the problem again. Sense. He had to use his sense. That's all it took to solve problems. Just sense. It came then. The logs he had selected were smooth and round and had no limbs. What he needed were logs with limbs sticking out. Then he could cross the limbs of one log over the limbs of another and weave them together, as he had done his wall, the food shelf cover, and the fish gate. He scanned the area above the beach and found 4 dry treetops that had been broken off by the storm. These had limbs, and he dragged them down to his work area at the water's edge and fitted them together. It took him most of the day. The limbs were cluttered and stuck any which way, and he would have to cut one to make another fit. Then cut one from another log to come back to the first one. Then still another from the third log would have to be pulled in. But at last, in the late afternoon, he was done, and the raft, which he called Brush Pile 1 for its looks, hung together, even as he pulled it into the water off the beach. It floated well, if low in the water, and in the excitement, he started for the plain. He could not stand it. He could not stand on it, but would have to swim alongside. He was out to chest depth when he realized he had no way to keep the raft at the plane. He needed some way to tie it to the plane so he could work from it, and for a moment he was stymied. He had no rope, only the bowstring and the other cut shoestring in his tennis shoes, which were by now looking close to dead, his toes showing at the tops. Then he remembered his windbreaker, and he found the tattered part he used for an arrow pouch. He tore it into narrow strips and tied them together to make a rope or tie down about 4 feet long. It wasn't strong. He couldn't use it to pull a Tarzan and swing from a tree, but it should hold the raft to the plane. Once more he slid the raft off the beach and out into the water until he was chest deep. He had left his tennis shoes in the shelter, and when he felt the sand turn to mud between his toes, he kicked off the bottom and began to swim. Pushing the raft, he figured, was about like trying to push an aircraft carrier. All the branches that stuck into the water dragged and pulled, and the logs themselves fought any forward motion, and he hadn't gone 20 feet when he realized that it was going to be much harder than he thought to get the raft to the plane. It barely moved, and if he kept going this way, he would just about reach the plane at dark. He decided to turn back again, spend the night, and start early in the morning. When he pulled the raft once more onto the sand and scraped it dry with his hand. Patience. He was better now, but patience still grounded him a bit, so he sat at the edge of the fish pond with the new spear and took 3 more fish, cooked them up, and ate them, which helped to pass the time until dark. He also dragged in more wood, endless wood, and then realized and watched the sun set over the trees and back of the ridge. West, he thought, and watching the sun set in the west. And that way was north, where his father was. That way east, and that way south. And somewhere to the south and east his mother would be. The news would be on the television. He could visualize more easy his mother doing things than his father, because he had never been to where his father lived now. He knew everything about how his mother lived. She would have the small television on the kitchen counter on and be watching the news, talking about how awful it was in South Africa, or how cute the baby in the commercial looked, talking and making sounds, cooking sounds. He jerked his mind back to the lake. There was great beauty here, almost unbelievable beauty. The sun exploded the sky, just blew it up with the setting color, and that color came down into the water of the lake, lit the trees, amazing beauty, and he wished he could share it with somebody and say, "Look there, and over there, and see that." But even alone it was beautiful, and he fed the fire to cut the night chill. There it is again, he thought, the late summer chill to the air, the smell of fall. He went to sleep thinking a kind of reverse question. He did not know if he would ever get out of this. Could not see how it might be, but if he did somehow get home and go back to living the way he had lived, would it be just the opposite? Would he be sitting watching television and suddenly think about the sunset up in the back of the ridge and wonder how the color looked in the lake? Sleep. In the morning, the chill was more pronounced, and he could see tiny wisps of vapor from his breath. He threw wood on the fire and blew until it flamed, then banked the flames to last and went down to the lake. Perhaps because the air was so cool, the water felt warm and he waded in. He made sure the hatchet was still at his belt and the raft still held together. Then he set out pushing the raft and kicking, swimming toward the tail of the plane. As before, it was very hard going. Once an eddy of breeze came up against him, and he seemed to be standing still. By the time he was close enough to the tail to see the rivets in the aluminum, he had pushed and kicked for over 2 hours, was nearly exhausted, and wished he had taken some time to get a fish or two and have breakfast. He was also wrinkled as a prune and ready for a break. The tail looked much larger when he got next to it, with a major part of the vertical stabilizers showing, and perhaps half of the elevators. Only a short piece of the top of the fuselage. The plane's body toward the tail was out of the water, just a curve of aluminum, and at first he could see no place to tie the raft. But he pulled himself along the elevators to the end, and there he found a gap that went in up by the hinges where he could feed his rope through. With the raft secure, he climbed on top of it and lay on his back for 15 minutes, resting and letting the sun warm him. The job, he thought, looked impossible. To have any chance of success, he would have to be strong when he started. Somehow, he had to get inside the plane. All openings, even the small rear cargo hatch, were underwater, so he couldn't get at them without diving and coming up inside the plane, where he would be trapped. He shuddered at that thought, and then remembered what was up the front of the plane. Down at the bottom of the lake, still strapped in the seat, the body of the pilot, sitting there in the water. Brian could see him, a big man with his hair waving in the current, his eyes open. Stop, he thought. Stop now. Stop that thinking. He was nearly at that point of swimming back to the shore and forgetting the whole thing, but the image of the survival pack kept him. If he could get it out of the plane, or if he could just get into it and pull something out, a candy bar, even that, just a candy bar, it would be worth it. But how to get at the inside of the plane? He rolled off the raft and pulled himself around the plane. No openings. 3 times he put his face into the water and opened his eyes and looked down. The water was murky, but he could see perhaps 6 feet. There was no obvious way to get into the plane. He was blocked. So what do you think Brian is going to do to be able to get into the plane? He's come all that way. He made his raft. What will Brian do? I guess we'll have to read on to find out. But Brian's pretty smart, so I'm sure he'll find a way. What do you think he'll do?